Hey, Calvary family, it's great to be with you this week. And we are in Genesis, and we are in the final chapters, not completely final, one more week of this, but we're in the midst of the Joseph story right now. And there's a lot of real estate given to Joseph. And that alone is noteworthy. I mean, if you look at it, only 2 chapters are given to creation. Over 12 are given to Joseph. So I don't know, maybe the making of a godly person is more intense than making of all creation. I don't know what that means, but there's a lot of chapters given to Joseph.
Now, before we get into our section for this week, read it. It's beautiful. It's much more what you would expect from a story. The narrative, the characters, read the whole thing, 40 to 47. It'll take you 15 minutes. But no, it is very, very moving and it's just emotionally well told. And so we're going to discuss it, but we're not going to summarize a lot of the stuff. So just go ahead and read it for yourselves first.
And so the making of a godly person, chapter 40, we see Joseph land in prison. That's pretty straightforward. In prison, he meets 2 men who are also thrown in prison, and they have a dream. Joseph is seen to be a person who has a gift for interpreting dreams, and he nails it. Both dreams the men have are prophetic, and they happened exactly as Joseph interpreted them. The 2 men are set free. One is free to go back to work. The other one's freed by being killed. Yeah. But note the end of the verse. The end of the verse says,
what happens with the chief cupbearer? He does not remember Joseph, but forgets him.
That's it. And that's a good verse. That's a good thing to actually meditate upon, because God is with Joseph. God's favor's upon him. This is what it looks like. For 2 years, he remains in prison, but God's doing something. God's preparing a person for ministry. God's preparing a person to be entrusted with much. And that leads us to chapter 41. And there we see Pharaoh having a dream.
Yeah, which no one can interpret. He brings out all his court wizards, wise men, and none of them can quite do it for him.
But then the cupbearer remembers, Joseph interpreted my dream.
Now, when Joseph comes to the Pharaoh, pay attention to what he says. It's not in me, but of God. This is the same Joseph who previously saw his dreams, and he saw all his brothers bowing down to him, and it pointed to his own authority, and it pointed to his... It puffed up his ego. He's learned since then. He's learned a lot since then.
Yeah, dungeon will do that for you, maybe. For some people. So God gives Joseph the interpretation, and then Joseph goes beyond the interpretation and gives a word of wisdom. And he tells Pharaoh how to apply what's been told to him. And so God gives his word and then gives Pharaoh the chance to believe and to respond to his word, which is so often the case. God gives his word, and then it's up to us to respond to it. And Pharaoh does.
And so Joseph is the man chosen to implement this plan, right? Of course, says he's looking for someone who's smart. Joseph's already came up with something off the cuff, apparently. So he becomes an Egyptian. He marries into the Egyptian priestly line. Pay attention to that. He speaks the language. With the birth of his 2 sons, he recognizes that he's seen God give him joy outside of the land that was, let's just say this. He recognizes with the birth of his 2 sons that God's given him joy, even in the land of his affliction, even outside of the land of his family, where he was originally born into, where he had all these promises. That's so far from him. It's almost like even his past with his brothers is a distant memory at this time. It's like he doesn't even consider himself to be that child of promise anymore. He is an Egyptian at this point.
Yeah, but then notice verse 57, it says, all the earth comes to buy bread from Egypt.
Yeah, and it's being handed to them by a Hebrew.
Yes.
And so now this is so important to the story up until this point. For the first time since that promise originally given to Abraham, that one of his descendants will become a blessing to the nations, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, none of them brought blessing to the nations around them. More often than not, they were coming into conflict with their neighbors, deceiving them. They're too busy deceiving their neighbors to be a blessing to them. Joseph actually goes through the necessary transformation, and he turns out to manifest that promise. That's huge. We've been expecting that. We've been looking for that. It's taken up until this point to see it happen.
So the whole Joseph study is this an incredible study on the pathways of God in building a person to be godly. And it's just not smooth. It's not easy. I mean, getting beaten up by your brothers, experiencing hatred, getting thrown into a pit, sold into slavery. I mean, if you were Joseph, you would not say you're being blessed. And even when he's experiencing great advancement, it's destroyed by false accusations and then prison. This isn't how you would write the story as far as a path to becoming like second in charge of Egypt. But God wasn't just building up a person. He was saving nations. And Joseph is now prepared to save nations. And so do this study. It's a beautiful study on the making of a godly person. And that brings us to chapter 42. And we meet the brothers the first time since they wanted to kill Joseph. And so the question is, what's Joseph going to do? That's right. What's he going to do with the brothers?
Oh, man. And this is why read it ahead of time. It's such a potently beautiful, beautiful scene.
Yeah. And in chapter 42, you'll see Joseph does not entrust himself to these guys. I mean, yes, they're his brothers. He recognizes them. But the last meeting they had, they were going to kill him. But instead, of course, they sold him into slavery. Joseph is going to test them first to see what's inside them. Have they changed at all? Are they still murderous? Is there any sorrow from their past?
Yeah. And in verse 22, Reuben acknowledges their sin against Joseph. And they don't realize that Joseph can speak Hebrew. Like, they don't get that. And so it's suddenly, even though he's named his son, right? He names his son like, I've forgotten my past life. I've moved on. Suddenly it comes back. And seeing his brothers confess to one another like what they've done. And he's so moved to tears, he has to leave.
Yeah.
And you're going to notice this. It's going to happen a couple times here.
Which is such a beautiful scene. Yeah. And so the brothers are still living it. And I think that's important for us to recognize. You don't just sin and leave it and forget about it, right? Sin has to be forgiven. Like, you can try to sweep it under the carpet and all that. It's just going to continue to haunt. It has to be forgiven. It has to be confessed. So let's move to chapter 43. So here, 43, we see Simeon is a prisoner now until his brothers come back with Benjamin, but they're delayed because Jacob procrastinates because he doesn't want to send Benjamin. He hopes things are just going to go away. They never go away. Procrastination never solves anything at all.
Yeah. Learn that in school, hopefully, really quick. So, all right, so they bring gifts. He sends them back with gifts, and because they're afraid that the money that ended up in their bags was like an oversight. Right? Which is like the kind of thing you would overthink about. Joseph seemingly jokingly says it's a gift from God. That's what he says to his brothers when they like present him with all this money. When he sees his younger brother Benjamin, he's again moved to tears. And the way it's written, it's as if he could barely control himself and he has to leave. Yeah. It's such a sad scene to see play out.
And then we have chapter 44, and here the test of tests are given. Joseph plants his diviner's cup into Benjamin's sack and frames him. He wants to see how the brothers are going to handle this. Do they treat Benjamin like they treated him? Because remember, Benjamin is Joseph's brother from the same mother. Okay, so will they treat him like they treated him? Will they abandon him? Are they going to be cruel to the second son of Rachel's? Does Joseph need to rescue his brother Benjamin from his other brothers?
And like we saw in verse 16, like their guilt is still there.
Right, it's thought about all the time. These events are all in their mind. Their sin is still with them.
Yeah. So what Joseph only now realizes after this whole test is had is that he's not the only one who's gone through a transformative experience.
Yeah, beautiful.
And his brothers are not the same people who sold him into slavery over 20 years ago.
Yeah, and it's Judah that really shines here.
Yeah.
Because Judah offers himself as a substitute for his brother Benjamin. He says, take me, but let my brother Benjamin go free. And this is a picture of what the Lion of the tribe of Judah would do on the cross. He would become our substitute. We were slaves to sin. Jesus took on our sin and sets us free. This is the very core of the substitutionary atonement.
Yeah, what beautiful.
Yeah, and what a scene it is. So now we move into chapter 45.
45, yeah. So prior to this, every time Joseph was moved to tears, he made sure to leave, right? But not this time. He breaks down in front of his brothers and he reveals himself, and it's to their horror because they're terrified, right? They knew where they left off with him, and they have no question about what's going to happen, right? It's such a deeply emotional scene. It will move you to tears. Notice verse 10, he promises to take this, and this is important. Verse 10 is, so he promises to take care of not only them, but their families.
Yes.
When he was a child, he did not know how to handle that responsibility. That's very probably the fear that they had when they saw that he was going to be the inheritor, right? As the tribal inheritor, you were responsible for your brothers and their families. Like, to what extent would you go to protect your own family? They went to the extent of throwing them in a pit. And so here it's at the end of it where he actually owns up to that and he makes that promise to them.
Yes, absolutely. And how do you even discuss this? If you think about this, going back home and the brothers are all together, how do you even discuss this thing with Joseph? Sorry about killing you and doing the whole slavery thing. I just wonder what the whole trip back to Canaan was like. And then how do we even tell Dad about this? Which moves us into chapter 46.
Yeah.
And there we have the movement of Jacob and the 12 sons and their families now to Egypt. And here they're going to become a nation. And it will be done just as it was told to Abraham in Genesis 15:13 by God, where they're going to be down there for 4 generations in Egypt, 400 years, so 100 years to a generation. But God promised he's going to take them out of Egypt.
And notice the irony, of course, this twist. Going to Egypt is presented as a positive in the narrative. It's an overwhelming scene of blessing. It's the first time they're backtracking since Eden, pretty much, right? And that's presented as a positive here. It's not going to be a positive for long. But in the narrative, in the closing of Genesis, that's how that is presented.
And what we just want to leave you with is this. Joseph is chosen by God. Chosen is never to the exclusion of others, but always to the responsibility to others, the responsibility to bless others. And Joseph has risen to the occasion. Hey, so God bless you guys. Have a beautiful day, beautiful night.